Eric Raile here from Political Science. Eric's been here since 2012 and he's a research assistant professor. Before that he came from North Dakota State University, and then he also worked in Washington at the U.S. Office of Government Ethics, and his sort of research area has been around the topics of corruption and public ethics, but now that he's come to MSU, he's taken on a new role, and that is director of a new social science laboratory and service, and it's called the HELPS Lab. So we invited him to talk, to hear about his research, but also to hear how the IOE and HELPS can work together to sort of advance social science initiatives. That's yours.
Yes. All right, good afternoon. I am Eric Raile, and we'll start with the name of the lab. We needed a snappy title, and I think we ended up finding one. It's easy to remember. But human ecology is a term that's emerged in the last few years. You start to see journals now with the name on it. You see colleges built around the idea of human ecology. And so we'll discuss what that is in a little bit. But that's the name of the lab. But we had submitted a proposal to the Vice President for Research and Economic Development, and that was the source of the majority of the funding thus far for the lab. And the people involved in that proposal were Dr. Liz Shanahan, Dr. Linda Young, Julia Hagerty, Jamie McAvoy, and David Moak. So we had all these faculty involved in building the proposal for the HELPS Lab. So one of the things that we have emphasized is that these resources are foundational. We're talking about resources that are necessary to conduct social and behavioral research. You see them at lots of universities, which we'll see in a few minutes here. But we've had some shortages here on campus, and so we were filling a real need. A few years ago, an external evaluation committee came here and looked at the social and behavioral sciences and said that facilities were lacking, that this in particular was something that we needed. And so this is, a few years later, a response to that and other needs, recognized needs around campus. And so we have tools here for social and behavioral researchers, but we've linked it to other things going on in campus, the natural and physical sciences, and it's really a set of tools that are available to the entire campus community. So this definition of human ecology, this is a standard definition pulled together from a few different sources. The study of relationships between people and their environments. Those environments can be natural, they can be social, they can be built or made environments. So it's really looking at complex systems, how they interact with one another in dynamic ways. But you take the social piece, you look at individuals in relation to their social environment, groups and how they interact, but then you can also add the natural world, the physical world, and things that we've built. And so that's the source of the title of the lab. So I've said these are foundational resources, but they're also something that will allow for cutting-edge research at MSU. Because we'll be able to look at interactions among social, ecological, and other systems, and there are a number of funding agencies now that are very interested in doing this. And this is a part of a lot of calls for proposals. We can focus in particular on the human footprint on ecosystems, and this is the interaction between people and the world. And then related policies. Research of all sorts, scientific research, other research, needs to be translated to people. It needs to make sense to the populace, to policymakers, so that they know what to do with it. And so that's also an emphasis here, understanding how this translates into policies and how you explain this to different audiences. So we're looking at research beyond disciplinary boundaries. Certainly it'll support research within those boundaries, but across disciplinary boundaries. So you have your interdisciplinary research, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary. You have all of these different terms that have emerged over the last couple decades, and the lab will help support all of that. And we also very conscientiously designed the lab and its goals so that it would align with the university's strategic objectives. And we'll take a look at that in a little while as well. Now, a lot of you don't come from the social and behavioral sciences or don't have much of a background in the social and behavioral sciences. So I wanted to talk a little bit about what it is we do in the social and behavioral sciences. One of the big goals here is to have social and behavioral scientists on campus work with the natural and physical scientists and do that in more seamless ways. And I think a certain level of understanding will help, but also let you know what kinds of resources are available on campus. But I should start by saying that there's a lot of diversity in approaches in the social and behavioral sciences. I'm going to focus down on the more scientific kinds of approaches that get used. But the social piece, when we say social and behavioral sciences, is people interacting, groups of people interacting. The behavioral part is typically individual level behavior, but we also include attitudes and perceptions and those sorts of things. And as you can imagine, the two interact frequently. Individual level behavior interacts with what's happening in social groupings. So you have this diversity. We have divides between more quantitative or number-based approaches and qualitative or not number-based approaches. And really that battle started in the 1950s and raged for a few decades in the social and behavioral sciences. And there was a lot of sorting nationally. People went certain places because there were like-minded people in those departments methodologically. But a lot of that has sorted itself out. And now you see more of a push for what we call methodological pluralism, accepting that we can learn from lots of different methods, and mixed methods, which is looking at a problem using various approaches to try to triangulate and get at answers. The non-scientific approaches, and I don't come from this background, and so I'm not an expert, but those kinds of approaches will say that there aren't universal truths, that things are more relativistic, that a lot of what we see is built by our interactions with one another. That's constructivism. We construct reality, especially social reality, in that manner. The world is subjective, and we can't generalize. So one of the reasons those approaches aren't scientific is we want to generalize in science. But those kinds of researchers will say, well, we're going to look at one thing very closely and carefully, and we aren't going to draw broader conclusions about how it applies anywhere else. Okay? So you have that going on. What they're doing is interesting and useful. I'm going to focus more on scientific approaches because we're all more likely to work with those scientific approaches. And for those of you in the natural and physical sciences, and if you're putting together proposals, that's going to make more sense. And scientific doesn't necessarily mean numbers-based, which I should mention. We'll talk about what scientific means here, but it doesn't mean that it's quantitative, that it's based on numbers. It means that you're using the scientific method. It really boils down to that. And you have different kinds of research, just like in the natural and physical sciences. You have basic research, which is more of your pure research, building and testing theories. You have applied research, which is looking at a particular problem, usually a policy type of problem in the social sciences. And exploratory research, which is being done to figure out what the concepts or variables are that should be included in any future investigation. So you have all of that, much like you do in the natural and physical sciences. You're using the scientific method, and going back to grade school, you always had that list of 5 or 6 items in the scientific method, right? It changes from one textbook to another. But the basic idea is that you're gathering empirical evidence, real-world evidence, and you're testing hypotheses based on that gathering. Then you take a look at your hypotheses, and you may reformulate, and you go back to the drawing board. But that same thing is being done by a lot of social and behavioral scientists. There is an attempt to be objective, to be neutral when you're analyzing a problem or a question. There's a focus on observation, much like there is in the natural and physical sciences. And a lot of times it's difficult to randomize and to use real controls, to utilize experimental methods in the social behavioral sciences, primarily because it's unethical or because you can't just start wars different places and see what happens. Right? So it's impractical as well. But mathematically and using other kinds of methods, you can try to replicate what gets done with experiments. So you can approximate that kind of methodology. You have a mixture of deductive and inductive approaches like you do in the natural and physical sciences. Oftentimes you'll try to deductively develop theories, but a lot of what happens is more accidental, right, or it's built from the bottom up, and so you have this mixture of deduction and induction. There is a big focus on measuring things accurately, and so we spend a lot of time on these ideas of validity and reliability, which might look familiar to you. And this requires good instruments, good methods, replicability, all of these things. So that looks similar. The activities that are carried out look similar. We try to define, we try to describe, explain in particular why and how things are happening. Try to make predictions, but they're probabilistic. Nothing is deterministic when you're dealing with people. And then the prescription piece is a little more controversial. You see that more in the policy sciences, where you say this is what should be done based on the evidence we've gathered and the testing we've conducted. But that can also be a part of science in the social and behavioral sciences. A lot of the analysis is mathematics-based. Again, some of it is not. You can follow these general guidelines and not be conducting mathematics-based analysis, but I'll take a look at some of what is. And so we're talking about descriptive and inferential statistics here, some geometric methods, and I'll give you some examples of all of those. Another commonality is that the approaches have been built since the 1940s and 1950s again, when we see the behavioral revolution in the social sciences. It's a community-based approach, so peer review and all of the same procedures that you see in the natural and physical sciences. And at this point, we're several decades in, and it's pretty well established. And again, we've gotten to the point now that there's a respect for different methods, and this idea that you can look at questions and get information in different ways. All right, so I grabbed some examples here. Some of these are from my work, and again, I'm only capturing part of what gets done in the social and behavioral sciences. I just wanted to give you a little flavor for some of what happens, especially in the more mathematical kinds of analysis. But this first part is from a paper my co-authors and I wrote on the concept of political will and what it is. And we took a scientific approach and said, how do you define it? What are the definitional pieces? And then how do you operationalize those different pieces? How do you turn them into something that could be assessed in the real world? And then what would be your assessment targets, or how might you construct measures based out of those operationalizations? So it's entirely a theory piece. There's no numbers in it anywhere, but it's using the scientific method just for definition and measurement purposes, which leads to other research. So this is a necessary precursor to doing other kinds of research. This is another piece I wrote with some co-authors, and this one is looking at the exchange of resources and legislative voting in Brazil. And this is sort of more of the higher end statistical work. This is inferential statistics. And so this is three-stage least squares regression with a series of equations that are being used. There are time series operators being used in here. Some of the variables have been transformed, so they're logged or they're logistically transformed. This is more of a political economy kind of piece, which is where some of my training was. But you get a sense of how this can become more complicated, right? You can use more sophisticated mathematical methods. Again, you don't need to, and there's a lot of research that doesn't and is good and valid research, but it gives you a sense of the direction that you can go. And then you also, and this is another piece with some co-authors, and we've got an economist on board, and he's the one actually doing all the calculus, solving equations. It's using formal mathematical theory to produce predictions that can then be tested empirically. So that kind of work gets done. This is an example of the geometric spatial method. This is a paper that looks at budgeting outcomes and predicts budgeting outcomes based on preferences of multiple different actors, and you get indifference curves, we call them, and then you get the most likely outcome given a constellation of two different policy areas. And so geometry has been used in that way in the social and behavioral sciences going back 2 or 3 decades now. And this is network analysis. This one's pretty involved. This was a study of cooperation and conflict in Chechnya about 10 years ago. Network analysis as a methodology is pretty accessible, and Liz Shanahan's going to be talking about it next month at one of these sessions, so I'm not going to steal too much of her thunder. Again, this is a complicated version. You may not even want to be this complicated. They're looking at a very complex problem. But you get a sense of how actors are connected, you have the size of the nodes, their centrality, all of this, and you've got these thicker lines that show more frequency of interaction. So you get a lot of information. You can turn those all into numbers, right? That all turns into data. And I'll talk about how you turn other kinds of information into data as well, with focus groups, interviews, and those kinds of methodologies, which are also very important. I do some work in those areas. I was in Michigan conducting some focus groups last week, but most of my background is not with those kinds of methodologies. So at some point, hopefully, we can have people who are more versed in those come and talk. So the basic supported activities in the lab, computer-based control environment experiments. You can do some experimentation in the social and behavioral sciences, and most of that is pre- and post-test kind of work. So you give somebody a pre-test, you expose them to something, usually it's a message of some sort, and then you post-test and you see if their views have changed at all as a result of that. So you're seeing more field experiments, and this is being led in some ways by economists, where you go out into the world and you send different information to different people, or you try different interventions in different ways in different places, and then you see what happens. Those, I think, are probably harder to get through the IRB, but that's a more complicated process. But you're seeing more of it, and they give you really good information when you're done. So you have a series of computers. You bring in your subjects. You have them engage in these experiments, and you get your results. Interviews and focus groups. You have a controlled setting of some sort, and we're making sure that we get technology that's mobile for the focus groups, so we can do this anywhere that you have a decent room for conducting focus groups. It won't necessarily need to be in Wilson Hall. But we'll have the ability to interview people there or remotely. And again, you want a controlled environment for that. We're conducting focus groups, and for those of you who aren't familiar, you get people in a room who have a certain characteristic, and you ask them questions or you stimulate conversation about a certain topic. And the big benefit of focus groups, well, there are two compared to interviews. One is that it's much faster because you don't have to go sequentially. But the other is that people start interacting, and they create, they lead down different paths than you might have expected, and they generate new information that way. We've also looked at some software, and maybe you've seen this if you've watched political debates, or the State of the Union address. CNN has done this, for example, that in real time you have people in the focus group watching something or listening to something, and they react to it, whether they like it more or less, and then you get these aggregate graph lines of what people think of the information they're hearing at any given point in time. There are other functionalities related to the software, but that's likely something that we'll be able to support at some point here. But interviews and focus groups, all of that text becomes data, and we have software programs. You can feed it into the software programs. You can analyze frequencies. You can see how often certain words appear, how often certain words appear in proximity to other words. You can identify themes and concepts based on the words that are used and how they relate to one another. So you can generate numbers, but you can also do a lot of fairly sophisticated analysis with information that you see coming out of an interview or a focus group. Mail-based surveys and web-based surveys. So as opposed to an interview or a focus group, this tends to be much more structured. You have response options for each item. The wording is very carefully constructed. You're typically aiming to gather information from a larger group of people. But we'll have the capability to do that through the mail or using the web. It might take a little bit longer, but we plan to be able to conduct telephone-based surveys. That one's a little more complex, and it requires additional resources. As you can imagine, getting good samples in the contemporary world is difficult with telephones. There are ways to do it, and people have been innovating on those frontiers, but it's more difficult than it used to be with people ditching their landlines and the inability to get cell phone numbers and all of those things. But what this involves is software. So each of these computers would have a microphone and a headset, and we'd likely be using or employing students to do this. So it would be work study. They would be trained, and they'd be gathering the information and learning Learning is, for the students, is a big purpose or goal for the lab as well. So the software tells them what to say, gives them the script, they click in an answer, and then they're branching questions oftentimes, it'll take them to the right place. So that's become pretty sophisticated in recent years, and not nearly as expensive as it used to be. We'll have facilities to transcribe, so when you conduct interviews and focus groups, sometimes you want to transcribe the data, sometimes you don't, but the basic idea here is that you write it all down, you convert it into text so that you can do other kinds of analysis, or so that it's easier to work with that information. And then software that allows data entry and analysis, quantitative and qualitative software programs. We're looking at a variety of programs that would be on a couple of the computers at least, and that would be available to researchers. All right, so I'd said this is foundational. These are standard resources. And so we'd taken a comparison group that's often used by MSU. These are land-grant institutions in the West, excluding California. These are the institutions in that group, in a group of 14 schools, including MSU. These institutions have something like this, either a basic social and behavioral science laboratory or a facility that's looking at human ecology, a laboratory that's looking specifically at human ecology kinds of questions, or both. Some of these institutions have both, and we are going to have both now. We were not in that category. The ones who did not were New Mexico State, South Dakota State, Nevada. None of those are Research 1 or very high research institutions. We were the only one in that category who didn't have this kind of facility, and that's just a bar graph showing you the same kind of information. So we're in the good category now. I talked about cutting edge research, looking at interactions between natural health systems and human systems. I have some examples here. The National Science Foundation is very interested in this work, and they have a few programs that look pretty explicitly at this: the dynamics of coupled natural and human systems, interdisciplinary research in hazards and disasters, and then interdisciplinary behavioral and social science research. They have all these programs now that are trying to find information about human ecology, essentially. The National Institutes of Health also have some programs. They now have an Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research and an interdisciplinary research consortia that's based on this idea of interactions. And then I've been working with the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is a federal governmental institution, and that's the work I've been doing in the state of Michigan. And they are very interested now. They're moving in the direction of caring about program implementation. So they're funding these different projects and research, and they want certain kinds of policies passed, but they don't necessarily know how to get there or how well these things are working. And so they're trying to include this in many of their solicitations. They want a program evaluation component, a policy kind of component, and that fits very well with what we want to do with the lab here. So the objectives and outcomes here, we have D1 and D2 from MSU's strategic plan. So with the lab, we hope to increase research productivity and quality and funding competitiveness. We don't want to be responding to solicitations and applying and saying, no, we can do this research, and then no, we don't actually have the facilities to do it, or we have to farm it out somewhere else. And that's just lost money. That's lost revenue for us because somebody's taking profit out of that. And so it's cutting down on our funding dollars, essentially. Increased capacity for complex and cross-disciplinary research, which is I2 in the strategic plan. I've talked about this at some length already. Increased collaboration with local and state entities. We've seen some interest already from entities outside who would like to contract with the lab to do some work for them. There are something like 400 non-governmental organizations in the Bozeman area. They call it the non-governmental capital of the world, or the nonprofit capital. So there are a lot of entities outside, and labs like this in other states are sometimes get state funding, but they do then work on behalf of the state government. And you have local governments, lots of different entities that potentially might want to collaborate on research. And eventually the lab could be a venue for disseminating information as well. We'd have to build a little bit to get to that point. Cost savings and revenue generation. So what I've already said is that if we can do things in-house at MSU, it's going to be cheaper for us. And if we can generate revenue from the outside, that's typically a positive thing. That fits with S4 from the strategic plan. Integrating teaching and research. Eventually, we have two objectives here. We'd like for students, and especially graduate students, I think will find it useful. These are dissertation resources and thesis resources, but even undergraduates might be able to take advantage of the resources that are being offered here, and they can learn about applied research and how it gets done in a hands-on way. Researcher attraction and retention. People like to have facilities, right? So the fact that we have these facilities now is going to make the institution more attractive. If you look at the retention literature and just, I guess in my discussions with people, it becomes a factor in whether you stay somewhere. This idea that you have facilities, you might not have them somewhere else, or you have better facilities one place than another. Now prior to applying for the funding, we gathered just very quickly in a cursory kind of way information about other people who are interested in using the facilities in the lab, and we suspect there's much more than this, but just even in a few days, business, earth sciences, education, HHD, LRES, and political science, we had people in all of those areas say that they'd be very interested in using the facilities. And so we had some examples that we included. This was the chart that was included. Environment and health links among Fort Peck tribes, and I've shortened these considerably, and so they're maybe not 100% accurate, but you get the basic idea. Social-ecological vulnerability in Richland County. Whitebark pine beetles and evaluation of ecosystems. We're going to be running a survey on this one out of the lab. It'll probably be one of the first things, or might be one of the first pieces of research that's conducted out of the HELPS lab. Technology integration for pre-service teachers. Language surrounding women's pay issues. Gaps in ecological and social flooding assessments. So you see some of these are more human ecology kinds of topics. Some are not, but there is a need and a desire to have these kinds of resources. And we talked to a number of people who said, you know what, I don't even think about research in a way that suggests that I have facilities available to me, right? When I think about research, I think, what kind of research can I do that doesn't require any resources or facilities? And that's not how you ask good research questions, right? You want to ask the questions and then be able to do it, not say, okay, I don't have any resources, what can I actually do? And too often that's what people were doing. So, to recap, we're talking about baseline resources for a very high research activity institution. I got my PhD from Michigan State University, and they have a similar operation. It's much larger at this point. It's a much more populous state, and they get some support from the state government, but we looked and they have 35 or 40 employees working in that facility. So you get a sense for the scope of what's going on at some of the much bigger institutions. It enables both cross-cutting and cutting-edge research. I've talked about how it aligns with multiple strategic objectives for MSU. We're talking about helping dozens of researchers across campus, maybe even more than that. We don't know what the real interest is at this point. We know there's significant interest, but we don't know just how big. We know it's big. We don't know how big. There are consequences for the community, for the states, beyond that when you're doing research that's generalizable, beyond the state of Montana. And another point to emphasize, and I haven't talked about this much though, is to the extent this helps with education at the university, we're helping to prepare engaged leaders and inform future decision makers. Hopefully we can help translate some science for them or get them involved in ways that they're likely to understand the science later. A lot of times in the public sector we don't see a really firm understanding of the science, and we'd like to see more of that. I mentioned the Startup Assistance and Vice President for Research and Economic Development. The College of Letters and Science has donated space for the lab and some other resources. Imbrie has also provided some startup assistance for the lab, and we'll be talking with others about their interests and what they want the lab to be able to do as we move forward here, that's really the next step. We need to talk to those people. We're going to equip the lab. Once we figure out exactly what we need to advertise to the campus community and eventually beyond the campus community, and then use the lab. And the use hopefully will start relatively soon, and we'll ramp up what we're able to do over time as we progress. So that is my overview. We have time left. I wanted to leave time to talk about all of this, for you to ask questions. There are other people in the room who have expertise that would certainly be useful to this discussion. But thank you for your attention, and we can...
Can you tell us where the facility is, what it looks like, and the staffing?
The facility it's 185 in Wilson Hall, and it's one of the drawbacks is that it's a little bit difficult to find your way back there. But once you figured it out, you're fine. It used to be the writing center, and so it's a long rectangular room, and it has desks in it right now. We may need to modify those a little bit. And it also used to, the attached room used to be a focus group or observation kind of room, and so there's a one-way mirror installed already that gets used as a classroom, and so we can use it for focus groups sometimes based on schedules, but that's why we want to also make sure that that's mobile technology that we can take other places. Experiments you would have to do there, but really most of the work that would be supported can be done other places if need be. And so we've even had discussions with Imbrie about having people take tablets out and do surveys in other parts of the state, and then supporting that. And we have some storage space that we've talked with the library about storage space for data, and with the College of Letters and Science. So that's where it is. We're currently working with facilities and others, ITC, to build up the facility itself. In terms of staffing, right now we have a number of people contributing. You saw those researchers I listed at the beginning. I'm the one who's serving as director right now. I'm the primary resource at the present time, and so managing a lot of this, including for now accounting and other sorts of things. And so as we generate revenues, and hopefully we'll be able to build and add to that capacity.
It might be useful to say that it's across from the Native American Studies office. That's kind of a marker.
Right. Yeah, so it's right across the hall from the main office for Native American Studies on the second floor of Wilson Hall.
How do you, it sounds like the projects haven't gotten started yet. I came in a little late. But how do you envision this project you mentioned on Fort Peck on environment and health working? You've got a vision of that yet?
You?
Oh, it's not mine.
That was Julie.
Yeah, that's a proposal that is it was an Imbrie proposal that was not successful, but it comes out of work that that Elizabeth Rink in Health and Human Development is really leading up, and she has a long history of working up on Fort Peck on various mental and community-served psychology issues, and that the tribes actually came to her and asked her if she could help them think about a methodology that would help them quantify and characterize the benefits of bison reintroduction on the reservation. And so we're still looking for money to support that. But that was an example that we gave, as part of the overview of the lab of what the kind of work that might be supported. And in that case, the lab would provide all the resources we need to do transcription and data analysis on the data that we have there. But I'm happy to talk to you afterwards if you want to learn more about what's been proposed there.
As an individual PI who may want to use these services for a proposal, do you see this being fee-based or like summer salary? Like how do you see this lab integrating with proposals?
Right. The immediate step is we're putting together an advisory committee that will assist in developing policies for all this. There are different models that you might use in capturing, and we want to get this figured out pretty quickly, but a lot of those are fee-based kinds of models, and whether it's based on actual resource usage or hours or however it is you calculate that. But we want people to be able to write this into their proposals. And again, that's one of the reasons this helps support proposals, right, is that you can say we have these facilities here, we can do the work on campus. But yeah, we're just starting. The funding started September 1, so we're just a few days into this at this point. But we're trying to move quickly, and there will be some kind of fee-based policy, I suspect, at some point. But we'd like people to be able to start writing this into their proposals.
Can I add
Yeah.
something? I'm Linda Young, head of political science, and I'm also working with Liz and Eric on this. And a couple of questions. One is that we're going to be putting together an advisory board, and we're going to need representatives by college. So if you want to be on the ground floor helping us determine those kinds of questions, please let me know if you're interested in being in the advisory board. What we plan to do is go around and talk to the deans, look for a little bit more money, and try to get people to serve on the advisory board. And also along that line, if you have research ideas, plans that are going to benefit from the lab, it would be great. Should I have them email me or you, Eric?
They can email me.
It'd be great if you could email Eric, because when we go to visit the deans, it'd be really helpful to say, did you know your faculty member so-and-so needs this for XYZ, right? When we're asking for money we didn't get all the money we needed. We're very grateful to Renee. We didn't get all the money that we need for the lab. So that's why we're going to be going around and asking for a little bit more. So knowing what you're doing, what you'd like to do, how you would use it is a very powerful argument when we approach the dean. And if you have an interest in being on the advisory board.
So also, can I have two comments? One is it's a typical way to construct a lab that is used by a lot of different social scientists. It's very typical, firstly, to have one lab that's used by a lot of people. In contrast to many of you, you have your own lab, right? You have your own space. So this is a really probably foreign idea to many of you. Very efficient. How these labs have worked in across the country is that there is a formula, but they're so proprietary, so we're really, they won't tell us. I know, it's very frustrating, but they'll help us to a certain degree. So we do have to figure this out, and there'll be some kind of a scale and all those sort of inputs that are important in deciding what the lab fee is. But what are those money used for? It's used for sustaining a lab. It's not just salary for the director. It's because you know what it's like, how often you have to replace computers, SPSF licenses, all of that. So the fee is really for ultimately to sustain a lab long term. So that's one comment. The other comment is that I would say that writ large, and Julie and Jamie, Eric, you guys can chime in on this, that the confluence of social science data and ecological data is really clunky. And I think that with the lab, that we are positioned to make some really important headway into how do our data, disciplinary or our social science and, for example, ecological data, geologic data, whatever, how can we actually take an interdisciplinary perspective on a transdisciplinary issue? So it's really, really exciting, and I think, anyway, I think part of it is having infrastructure, and part of it is the work of the IOE and how we have made these different connections across campus, and now we have tools that we can actually move forward in a really important way.
Yeah, in February, the IOE sponsored a meeting that brought social and ecological scientists together to talk about some ideas. I think some really good ideas came out of that discussion, but again, we didn't really have the resources to pursue all of them, and now we're getting much closer to that. And we don't, so those models, those pricing models are proprietary, but we have estimates, and we can sort of backwards engineer to figure out what they're doing.
So one of the things that came out of that meeting was the need for a statewide survey to sort of assess people's attitudes about things like climate change and environmental change of various types. How easy or how close would you guys be to taking on something like that? Because the other alternative for us was to go to Stanford University, and they have that set up, and it would cost $60,000, $70,000.
Right, and you were looking at phone survey, right?
I think so. I think so.
The mail survey capacity isn't going to take as long, but like I said, we're working. We may have some external funding to get the phone survey capacity up and going. That takes a little bit longer because you've got to get the workers trained and all of that, and then regardless of the funding model, the money coming in would help support staff, and so we might start off just by a project-by-project basis, hiring people part-time to administer what's happening in the lab. And so that would need to all be figured out. But I think if we have the funding, I think within a few months that'll all be ready to go.
So I would also add that we haven't gotten approval for this yet, but with the White Bark Pine survey, it will be a mail-based survey, and I'm thinking because we got the lab and we don't have to outsource this to someone more expensive, we might be able to do a tri-state, so all of Montana, all of Wyoming, and all of Idaho. And it is a mail-based survey, but we may be able to, provided we get sort of permission from our cooperating partners, to embed some of those questions. So not only could we get statewide answers to some of those attitudinal questions on climate change, but also we could get a tri-state, which would be super awesome.
And we'd have a sampling frame at that point. We'd have to acquire the sampling frame from Montana, and so we could use that on other projects for a while. You have to update it after a while because addresses and
that's
phone
the
numbers
project with Andy Hansen et al. Right. I just have a question whether anybody's working on decision-making support software and whether that's been involved in any of the conversations so far.
We have not talked about decision-making support software, no.
What is
So-
that?
I mean, I think you might be able to describe it better, but it seems like it's really useful in these kind of ecological, social kind of question areas, and it really requires a lot of computer software expertise in order to build these systems whereby people can look at a range of different outcomes based on their different choices that they would make even in their community or in the state or et cetera, but maybe you can add to that.
Well, there are different kinds of decision model pieces of software. So you can build something from the ground up if you have a programmer that can help facilitate decisions. There's also software that helps, you could help researchers try to work together more effectively. And that you can get that off the shelf, and there are probably even free versions of that. We'd have to talk to computer scientists about that probably, because another one of the methods that you're starting to see used in the social and behavioral sciences that I didn't mention is dynamic computational modeling. And so I had a professor at Michigan State University who had taken the situation in Rwanda, and you have all of these actors in the model, and then you have parameters, and then it's dynamics, you see what happens over time, and he was able to identify just what role radio played in the onset of the slaughter in Rwanda. So you can do that kind of modeling. It seems to me that kind of modeling would be really useful for a lot of ecological problems. So there's software available to do that kind of thing as well, which is not something we've envisioned quite yet. We're trying to get started what we know we can do immediately, and then we're hoping to build on those capabilities as time goes on.
I've been told in the couple human natural systems programs that it's really important to have agent-based modeling as a component of that. Is there anyone in the region that does that or has expertise in that kind of modeling?
I don't know who does it. The dynamic computational modeling is agent-based modeling. Some of the formal modeling, so that the mathematical model is also agent-based. There are also less intensive methods of agent-based modeling. So I've done a little bit. Liz, I think you've...
I wouldn't put myself in that camp.
Maybe not in the modeler camp, but familiar, familiar with, yes.
Can you briefly say what agent-based modeling is?
So agents are people who are going out and acting, right? They're exerting agency. They're conducting activities. They're doing something. And so a lot of the models in political science are principal agent models. The principal is the one overseeing. You can think of Congress, right, as the principal, and then the bureaucratic agencies are agents. They're just supposed to be doing what Congress says, and we know that's not how it works. But you can build models like that where there's principal agent modeling, or it's agent modeling from the bottom. How are people acting and interacting, and then what comes out of that? And so a lot of that is the dynamic computational modeling. And Clem said there was somebody here who does it when we were talking with him about it. So yeah, there's somebody on campus.
Yeah, Jeff pulled it out.
Yeah, okay.
On the ecological side.
Right.
I mean, the appeal for the CNH program is the idea that you can have dynamic ecological models demonstrating change that have really meaningful human actors who are responding to and shaping those dynamics. And the agent doesn't necessarily have to be human.
So I would say that something I get pretty excited about is the use of shared state space models for interdisciplinary work. So we can talk about coupling models, but if you're going to do that, you need to agree on some sort of data model that both of your models and your own processors can look at, and you can then design them more or less independently, but if they're sharing the same state space, they can see the same variables and they can have their own effects on those variables. And if we could come up with a platform for doing that, and that's something that we could build out of this facility, it would be really exciting. That's the real key to coupling those models.
Having them interact in the same
What
environment.
your data model is.
Yeah.
And having some abstraction that you both use, and then you can build your own specialties on top of it.
Right. That's very useful, and we'll have to pursue that talk as we go on here.
I just wanted to mention that the Montana Water Center is going to have a call for proposals soon. We have a small amount of money that could help support something like this, but look out for that call if you're interested in coupling this type of work with ecology or issues about water supply. Or it's a little bit of money, but it could help. So especially, and we're going to give priority to interdisciplinary teams. So if you can build a big team, it would be really compelling. So just throw it out there. And I'll be talking more about that next week, the Water Center in general. So.
Thank you.
What's the plan for informing policy and linking the results with decision makers?
Like I said, so in some states where they built more support for this, the decision makers actually ask these institutions to conduct, and they tend to be centers, so they're a little bit broader than what we're talking about here, but to conduct the research and then to produce reports out of it that will inform the decision-making process. So like the program evaluation I'm doing in the state of Michigan right now, the next phase of that research is I'm writing a legislative advisory committee report to tell them what we found and to make certain suggestions and recommendations. And so there's that, and then there's also dissemination. So how do we get information about the studies out to the people? In Michigan, they have a survey that they run every quarter, every 3 months, and they analyze some of the data and then they write up a report and they disseminate it. But that's more institutionalized, but that's the sort of thing that you can do.
So this would be like very kind of project-driven then, or would the Help Center have kind of their network that they could help disseminate information to policymakers or do kind of outreach?
The outreach and dissemination is probably a little bit farther down the road. Immediately, it's going to have to be project-driven because there aren't other resources to support those other administrative kinds of functions. A little bit of that, probably, the dissemination, but that won't be a primary function right away.